Welcome to Presume Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 96 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about implementing change password page in ASP.NET. When the user clicks on password reset link, the user lands on change password.aspx page. In fact, in part 95 of this video series, we discussed about generating and emailing the password reset link. The password reset link looks something as shown below here in the image. In fact, I can show you the email that we generated in part 95 of this video series. So the link looks like this. The password reset link looks like this. When the user clicks on this link, obviously, as you might expect, the user is going to land on this page change password.aspx. And if you look at the URL, it has got a query string with name UID. Okay, and its value is a 32-digit number, which is a globally unique identifier. So from this URL, we will retrieve this grid value, the globally unique identifier value, and then we'll look that up in the database. So in the database, we have this TBL reset password request, which is going to keep track of all the requests that were generated by users by assigning a globally unique identifier. And to that identifier, there is a user ID tied. Okay, so we look up that globally unique identifier, find out who is the user, and then use that user ID to look up in TBL users and change their password here. Okay, so once we change the password or update the password, we are going to delete this row from TBL reset password request. Okay, because we want to make this link invalid after the users change their password. We don't want to keep these links valid and active forever. Okay, we want to change them after they change their passwords. In fact, in reality, organizations will enforce some kind of expiration policy. Some organizations might say after the user has generated the link, he need to change the password within 5 working days or 10 working days. After that, the link is automatically expired. Okay, so there's some kind of expiration policy just to for security reasons. Okay, now let's go ahead and see how to implement this change password page. So obviously the first thing to do is to write a stored procedure which will check if that link is a valid link. How do we know if that link is a valid link? We pass that globally unique identifier to the stored procedure. The stored procedure will check if there is a row with that value within this TBL reset password request. If there is a row, then some user has generated a password reset request. If not, then we know that somebody is trying to use some random globally unique identifiers to fool the system. Okay, so the simple way to check if that link is valid or not, check TBL reset password request table. If the row with that ID exists, then we know it's a valid request. Otherwise, it's an invalid or an expired link. Okay, and that's what we are exactly doing within the stored procedure here. So I have a stored procedure sp is password reset link valid, and to this stored procedure we are passing in just a globally unique identifier. There's only one parameter of type unique identifier. So this stored procedure is expecting a globally unique identifier value. So we pass this value to that stored procedure, and if you look at the stored procedure, what it's doing, it's saying select user ID from TBL request table. So if you look at this table, TBL password reset table, this is the table. So let's execute just this query. So if you look at that table, so there is an user ID column. So we are trying to select the user ID from TBL reset password request, where ID is equal to whatever we pass in as an input parameter to the stored procedure. Okay, so if there is a user ID for that globally unique identifier, then there will be something. This exists function will return false if the user ID is null, or if the user ID does not exist for the given input globally unique identifier. Okay, so if it exists, we know that it's a valid password reset link. So we are saying select 1 as is valid password reset link, otherwise 0. You can even quickly test that. Look at that. If I pass this in here, if I replace that as an ID, as you might expect, it's going to return some user ID. Look at that. On the other hand, if I change this to some random stuff, and if we execute that, look at that, it doesn't return anything. So if exists will be false. If that's false, then it comes here and it says select 0 as is valid, okay, which is false. So now we will use the stored procedure in our application to check if the reset link is valid or not. So that's the first thing we have to do. And the next thing is we want to actually change the password after we test it. So the first thing, so we want to call the stored procedure within our application. So how do we do that? In order to call a stored procedure, we need to write some ADO.NET code, and we have seen how to do that in the previous sessions as well. So I'm going to quickly copy and paste some ADO.NET code. But before that, if you look at the change password page itself, it's pretty straightforward. All it has is the static text new password, confirm new password, and then two text boxes where the users can enter their password and confirm new password, and then they click the save button. And here again we have some required field validators and compare validator to make sure new password and confirm new password match up, and then a validation summary control and a label control to display status message. Okay, so what's the first thing that we want to do? When the page loads up, we want to call that stored procedure, because when the user lands on this page, at that point of time we want to tell to the user, is that password reset link valid or invalid. So for example, if I build this at this point, and then if I click on this link, when the user first lands on our application using that link, look at that, as soon as he comes onto this page with this globally unique identifier, if that is existing within this table, then I want to say, okay, it's a valid link, otherwise it's an invalid or expired link. Okay, let's see how to do that. So we need to call that stored procedure. So obviously if you want to call stored procedure, you need to use some of the ADO.NET namespaces, system.data and system.data.sql client and system.data.configuration. System.configuration. Okay, so let's copy and paste simple ADO.NET code. I have a function here which is a reusable function. So if you look at this function, it's pretty generic function. This function's name is execute sp, and this function is going to return a true or false. So if you look at the stored procedure that we have here, it either returns 1 or 0. 1 if it's valid, 0 if it is invalid. 1 can also be typecasted into true and 0 to false. So basically this function execute sp is going to return true or false. So what is this function going to do? It's going to take in a stored procedure name and then list of SQL parameters. So if you look at the stored procedure, it's expecting only one input parameter. So I'm going to pass that into this function. Okay, so I'll pass the SQL parameters collection and the stored procedure that I want to execute. It's as simple as that. And this function is going to go ahead and execute that sp with that parameters and return either true or false. Okay, so basically if you look at this code, it's very straightforward. We are using the configuration manager class to read the connection string from web.config file, create the SQL connection object, and create the SQL command object. Now here I have not hard coded the stored procedure name because I'm going to reuse this function to call any kind of stored procedure on this page. That's why it's a generic sp name. And then the command type is stored procedure. And then look at this, I'm using a for each loop to loop through each parameter in this list of parameters. So for each SQL parameter in sp parameters. So what is sp parameters? The list of parameters that we are passing into this function. And we are adding each parameter to the command object. Open the connection and look at this. I'm using execute scalar. Why am I using execute scalar? Because my stored procedure is going to return a single scalar value, either 1 or 0. Okay, so I'm using execute scalar, and if you look at the return type of execute scalar, it's an object type, but this function returns a boolean, a true or false. So we need to convert that object type into true or false, and that's what we are doing here by using convert.toBoolean. So now I'm going to use this function in my page load event. Okay, and even before that, let's go ahead and write another function which will basically call this stored procedure. And why are we using this stored procedure? To check if that password reset link is a valid or an expired link. Okay, so I have another function here. Let me go ahead and copy. Again, this function is very straightforward one. It has hardly got 2 lines of code within that. So all this function does here is it creates. So if you look at this function, all it does is it creates a collection, a list of SQL parameters. So list of SQL parameters, parameter list is equal to new list of SQL parameter, and then so that is a list of SQL parameters, and I'm creating a new SQL parameter object. Since this stored procedure has only one input parameter, I'm using just one parameter object. Okay, so the parameter name is @GUID, so at globally unique identifier. And where is the value coming from for that one? The value will come from the query string. Okay, so that's why we are saying request.queryString. And what is the name of the query string variable? UID. So we are retrieving that UID from the query string. Okay, and what are we doing with that parameter list object? We are actually passing that to this execute sp method. So if you look at this execute sp method, we are actually calling that here. And what sp do I want to execute? What stored procedure? Sp is password reset link valid. That's the one I want to execute. So that's the name of the stored procedure, and that's the list of parameters. But here, this parameter list has got only one parameter because our stored procedure expects only one input parameter. Okay, that's it. We are returning whatever this execute sp returns. What does this execute sp returns? A true or a false. And look at that. This function is also returning a true or false. So whatever this function returns, it's going to return that back to the caller. Okay, so where am I going to use this function? I'm going to use this function in my page load event. Okay, so let me save that, and within my page load event, what am I going to do? So when the page first loads up, look at that, if not is post back. So when the page first loads up, I'm calling this function. So which function is that? Is password reset link. So this function is going to return a true or false. So if it returns false, then what do I want to do? If is password reset link is not valid, then I'm showing a message here. Label message.text is equal to password reset link has expired or is invalid. And before that, we are setting the label color to red just to indicate that it's an error message. That's it. So pretty simple and straightforward. Simple ADO.NET code. So now let me build this. Control Shift B, the keyboard shortcut to build the application. Now let me go ahead and click on this link now. So if I click on this link now, as soon as the page loads up, look at that. That's a valid link. If you look at this GUID, the globally unique identifier, this exists within this database table. So if you look at that TBL password request table, so I have something that's ending in 8FA. But on the other hand, look at that. I will change that maybe to 8F1 or something like that and press enter. Look at that. The moment I do that, password reset link has expired or is invalid. Okay, so we figured out to check, whether the password reset link is valid or not. The next step is basically when the user clicks on that button, we need to change the password. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do is to write a stored procedure to actually change the password. Okay, so I have another stored procedure here which actually changes the user password. And look at this. This stored procedure takes in two input parameters, the globally unique identifier and the new password that we want to change it to. Okay, so what are we doing here? We are declaring a variable to hold user ID, and from TBL password request, look at that. That's again the same code. We are taking this globally unique identifier from the URL, whatever is passed into the stored procedure, and then we are retrieving, okay, check TBL TBL reset password request table. Is there a row that matches this globally unique identifier? If that's the case, retrieve the user ID from there, and if user ID is null, then we know that it's an invalid one. So that's why select 0 as is password changed. So which means the password is not changed. Else, if the user ID exists, what do you want to do? We want to update TBL users table, change the password. So if you look at this, we want to update this TBL users table, update this password column. For which user? For the user ID that you have retrieved from TBL password request. So from TBL reset password request, we retrieve this user ID, and if there is a user ID, then we look up that user ID within this TBL users table, and we change the password. We update this TBL users table, and that's exactly what we are doing here. And after we do that, we are actually deleting from TBL reset password, this row from TBL reset password request. So if you look at this, delete from TBL reset password request, where ID is equal to at that, whatever is the unique identifier, so this row gets deleted. And finally, you're selecting 1 as is password changed, which means true. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to actually call the stored procedure from our .NET application. Okay, so let's flip to Visual Studio. So let's write another function to actually change the user password. So I have another function here, private boolean change password. So let's copy this and paste within our SQL Server, Visual Studio. So I have this function, private change password. So if you look at this function, we have a compilation error here. So if you look at this one, forms authentication. Okay, this forms authentication class, this is present in system.web.security namespace. So let's go ahead and import that. So system.web.security namespace. So that should get rid of that compilation error there. And then if you look at this again, it's going to be very straightforward. All this function does, change user password. Look at that. This function is going to call this stored procedure, sp change password. And if you look at the stored procedure, it's expecting 2 input parameters. So all you have to do is create a parameter list object, just like the one before. This function calls this stored procedure which has only 1 input parameter, but this function is going to call a stored procedure which has got 2 input parameters. This is the first input parameter and this is the second input parameter. Okay, so the first input parameter is the globally unique identifier, and that's what we are passing in. Where is the value for that coming from? From the query string, so request.query string of UID. And then the next parameter is the password itself. So where is the password coming from? The password comes from either new password or confirm new password, any text box. Okay, but remember, we are encrypting and storing passwords in that table, so we have to encrypt that. So the password is basically hashed, so we need to hash that. And how are we doing that? Using hash password for storing in config file method. So we are retrieving the value, the password from the text box. We are using SHA-1 as the algorithm and then passing that value as the parameter value. Okay, and finally what you're doing, you're calling that execute sp method. So if you look at that execute sp, it's the same method. It expects the stored procedure name and the list of parameter objects, and that's what you're passing in here. And whatever this function returns that you are returning back, this function returns a boolean, your function return type is boolean, so they match up. Okay, very simple and straightforward. Now we'll have to call this in button save click. Okay, so when the user clicks that save button, that's when we need to call this function and actually update the user password. And if you look at that, that's again very straightforward. Okay, hardly 2 lines of code there. So when I click the button there, what we want to do, if change user password, so this function is going to return a true or false. True if the password is changed successfully, otherwise false. So if this function returns true, then the label message for the label you're setting the text as password changed successfully. Otherwise, you're setting the color to red, and then obviously password reset link has expired or is invalid. It's as simple as that. Okay. Alright, so with this, let's build this. Now let's go back to our application, click on this password reset link. So it's a valid link that is present within our system, so it will not show any error message here. Now let me go ahead and change the password to test1. So test and test1. I click save. So password changed successfully. Test1 is my new password now, and I can even log in. And look at that. Before that, let's go ahead and check what happened to the request. The request is successfully deleted from TBL reset requests table. Okay, so now if I go ahead and click on this again, look at that. I get an error. Password reset link has expired or is invalid. So if I click on this link, land on this page, as soon as the page loads up, Why? Because that globally unique identifier doesn't exist in that table. And at this point of time, if I try to change the password again and click save, look at that, I get the same error message. Okay. So in this session, we have actually seen how to change the user password based on that reset link. In the next video session, we'll discuss about changing password by providing the current password. On the slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.